Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and for some people, good evening. My name is Miriam Anderson. I am the treasurer and the member of the Programs Committee for the World Affairs Council Tacoma. Welcome to today's program. Today's program is hosted by us, World Affairs Council Tacoma, and also United States and State Department. Today's program is brought by Tacoma Creates. Thanks to Tacoma Creates for funding our programs for the year of 22 and 2023. I'm going to keep my comments very brief and very short. I will introduce Irina Karnakova. She's our point of contact with the State Department. She has been a key and most important person in recruiting and helping us find an amazing speakers like today's. So Irina, go ahead and make a few introduction about the State Department and the speaker programs that you have.
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to be here. My name is Irina Karmanova. I'm with the State Department's Office of Public Liaison, and our mission is to connect the American public with some of our foreign policy experts to have dialogue on some of these really key issues. So really appreciate you all tuning in. We have a great speaker for you all today. But before I turn it over for introductions of our speaker, I'll play a quick 1 minute long video. Most of you already know all of this about the State Department, but for those folks on the line who are just getting interested in foreign affairs, hopefully this will help you want to learn more.
It's a wonderful and complex world out there, filled with challenges and opportunities. That's why America's diplomats with the U.S. Department of State are on the job every day, representing you. We are advancing America's foreign policy interests by uniting our allies, confronting our adversaries, and protecting our citizens. We advance democracy, human rights, global health, and more. We grow markets that create American jobs. We are America's first federal agency, and we're in 190 countries at over 270 U.S. embassies and consulates, serving you. We are the United States Department of State.
Thank you for your attention, and I'll turn it back over to the World Affairs Council.
Thank you so much, Irina. I will introduce Sam Kaplan. He's our board member and also the moderator today's program. I have known Sam for many, many years, and he has an extensive background dealing with China and its policy. Sam is going to introduce the speaker and outline today's program. Thank you once again for coming to today's program. And Sam, go ahead and start the program.
Thanks, Miriam, and thanks everybody for attending this morning, even on a snowy day. And probably we're all doing it from warm rooms, hopefully. I'm excited to introduce our speaker, who's an expert on China and currently working in Africa and doing this late at night. So we very much appreciate it. You're doing this late at night. Well, there's a lot happening in China nowadays. Sometimes it feels like months are happening in weeks and years happening in months there. And of course, this is all important to Africa, a continent with 54 countries and lots of stuff happening there as well. So we're lucky to have William Campbell here today to help us think through all of this. He's currently the economic officer for the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi, Kenya, covering regional and political issues there, including countries like Malawi, Kenya, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and a variety of others. But he has long and deep experience in and with China. He was stationed in Chengdu in the early 2010s, where I gather he must have met Bill Marshak, who's on today. He's seen a lot of changes in China over the years. Most recently, he was the digital economy officer at the embassy in Beijing, and that was during a time of great change in that industry. So he's had lots of exciting times, lots of expertise, and lots of experiences in China. So it's a real thrill to have you here today, Will, to help us think through this. Looking forward to your presentation. For those who have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat room and we'll call you when we get to the Q&A period, but feel free to put your questions ahead of time in the chat room. So let's give a big welcome to William Campbell. Will, who is scoffing at our snow because he's from the Midwest originally. The floor is yours, Will.
Well, thank you, Sam, for that very nice introduction, and thank you to the World Affairs Council for inviting me here today. I'm really honored, and Undersecretary Countryman, thank you as well for joining us. Really, again, it's a real pleasure and honor to be able to get online and have some of these discussions. I'm going to walk through a few things in my presentation, and then happy to have kind of a back and forth discussion once I'm complete. If you see me yawning, please do not take that as any sort of indication of my level of enthusiasm for this conversation. Just understand that it's about 10:30 at night over here, so I am a little bit tired, but I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So I'm just going to walk through a little bit about PRC's global ambitions, and then where Africa fits into these ambitions. Talk briefly about how the PRC is approaching relations with Africa. And then really spend the bulk of my time right now talking about what the United States Africa strategy looks like. And then, like I said, happy to have a discussion afterwards. So the National Security Strategy released by the White House in mid-October this year identified the PRC as the United States' main long-term strategic challenge. And it identified it as this because China is the only player with both the intent and increasingly the capacity to reshape the current global economic, political, security, and technological order. The PRC has designs to replace the current rules-based international system with a relational order with Beijing at the center, where rules and norms would no longer determine the course of how interstate disputes and cooperation would take place, but rather, if Beijing has its way, its own interests and Xi Jinping thought would determine the outcomes on the global stage. So where does Africa fit into these ambitions? Well, sub-Saharan Africa really is central to the PRC's efforts to leverage its partnerships in the global South and advance its ambitions on the world stage. Africa's strategic importance to the PRC, therefore, extends really beyond being just a source of raw materials or a market for PRC goods. But in recent years, the PRC-Africa relationship is evolving and is really at an inflection point. Official PRC lending has dropped dramatically since 2016, and several countries are in danger of debt distress. While kind of the public perception often ties that to the economic relations with the PRC, and its bilateral and regional engagement is facing increased scrutiny among African publics. When you factor those things in with kind of the current COVID situation in China and the economic strain the country has been under over the course of this year and into last year, it's reasonable to expect really that PRC's engagement in Africa is going to look different in the near to medium term. But that leaves a few open questions, specifically in relations that have in recent years been largely transactional. Will fewer transactions diminish the prospects that PRC will be able to count on Africa's multilateral voting bloc in the future? And then in what ways can African governments really depend on the PRC moving forward? Those are questions that I don't think we'll be able to answer tonight in this discussion, but just things that kind of are on my mind as I look at what the PRC and other actors kind of are doing around the world. So what does the United States Africa strategy look like? In order to really answer this, I'm gonna rely heavily on Secretary Blinken's remarks that he made while in South Africa in August of this year, as he explained the president's vision for U.S.-Africa relations. Our strategy really is rooted in the recognition that sub-Saharan Africa is a major geopolitical force and one that has shaped our global past, is shaping our global present, and will shape our global future. By 2050, 1 in every 4 people on the planet will be African. Young Africans today and a generation yet to reach adulthood will shape the destiny not only of the continent, really, but of the world. And so our strategy focuses on what we will do with African nations and peoples, not for African nations and peoples. And it stands on kind of 4 strategic priority areas. The first being openness. We'll work with African partners to foster the capacity of individuals, communities, and nations to choose their own path and shape the world we live in. Africa and African people should not be treated as instruments of other nations' progress, rather than the authors of their own, as has happened far too often throughout history. Neither the United States nor anyone else should dictate African governments' choices. As mentioned, African nations and leaders have been instrumental in shaping the rules of the international system, and the United States and the world will look to African nations to help defend those rules. So openness is a means of creating pathways for the free flow of ideas, information, and investment, which in the 21st century really requires digital connectivity. That means building and adapting the infrastructure that enables that connectivity, an open, reliable, interoperable, and secure internet, data centers, cloud computing, and the United States is looking at several methods to promote development in these areas. The next is democracy. The United States stands ready to work with African partners to fulfill the promise of democracy. The overwhelming majority of people across Africa prefer democracy to any other form of government. In fact, even greater majorities oppose the authoritarian alternative to democracy. More than 70% reject military rule, and more than 80% reject one-man rule, according to the Africa-based polling organization Afrobarometer. African citizens clearly want democracy, but democratic governments need to be able to deliver for them by improving the lives of their citizens in tangible ways. Democracy is not an area where Africa has problems and the United States has solutions, clearly. The United States and all democracies face common challenges, which we need to tackle together as equals alongside other governments, civil society, and citizens. And this is one reason why the president invited representatives from several democracies around the world, including Africa, to the United States for the Summit on Democracy towards the end of last year. And we'll continue this conversation by working with partners to tackle 21st century threats to democracy, like misinformation, digital surveillance, and weaponized corruption. We'll focus on the connection between democracy and security and promote more peaceful, more inclusive, more resilient societies in places where conditions are ripe for conflict. The next priority area is economic recovery and resilience. The United States is working together with African partners to help them recover from the devastation wrought by COVID-19 and Russia's unjust war in Ukraine, and to lay the foundation for broad-based sustainable economic opportunity to improve the lives of all our peoples. We're rallying countries and international institutions such as the G20 and IMF to step up on key challenges like debt relief. And across a range of fields, the United States is working with African partners to try to unlock innovation and growth. As we do, we're building on African-led initiatives such as the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which, when fully implemented, will comprise of the 5th largest economic bloc in the world. And also the African Union's Agenda 2063, which is Africa's vision for development into the future. The United States has invested over $100 billion in the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, since its inception in 2003. And together with partners across the region, we've saved the lives of an estimated 21 million people. In addition to providing nearly 200 million doses of safe, effective COVID vaccines to African countries through the pandemic, free of charge, the health systems that we've built together over decades of engagement have saved countless lives. The networks of clinics and human capacity we have helped build have delivered the critical care and vaccination required to fight COVID. These efforts are making a lasting difference in the lives of millions of Africans. And the final priority area is climate change. Africa is among the global leaders on the clean energy transition that we need to save our planet. Where we look to work more closely with African countries is in helping them adapt to the effects of climate change and provide transitional energy to power economic opportunity. The United Nations recognizes Africa as the most vulnerable region in the world to the effects of climate change. Not too long ago, we had to imagine those effects, but today we're living them, and people who are already struggling and vulnerable are being hit the hardest. We recognize that this imbalance that we're asking for the least polluting countries to forego some of the development steps that have made advanced economies rich really places a great responsibility on countries like the United States to both reduce our own emissions while also helping other countries make the transition to clean energy and adapt to a changing climate. All that is part and parcel of what we call a just energy transition. The reality is that these 4 priority areas were each first championed by Africans: the interconnectedness of our health and our climate, the principle that all nations should have the right to choose their own fate, the idea that inequity within and between nations threatens our shared security and prosperity. This is why we say that our approach to relations with African nations, is about Africa. It's not about the PRC. And with that, I think I'll conclude my remarks, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Will. That was fantastic. That's a lot of ground you covered. Well, people are starting to think through their questions. Maybe I'll ask one to get us started off with. Earlier on, you're talking about the economy and what's happening in Africa and also with China. There's been an effort to try to diversify supply chains out of China. Do you see the possibility of some of that moving to different parts of Africa? And is the State Department trying to help out with some of that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and one really that as an economic officer by trade, is really kind of near and dear to my heart. And, again, I was covering technology when I was in Beijing, covering technology issues while I was in Beijing. And one thing that I think the world is struggling with, as we look to kind of de-risk our supply chains and break some of our over-reliance on the PRC for some of the critical technologies that are that are really driving the modern economy. One of the things that the world is struggling with is kind of where it envisions Africa in this, right? And I think personally speaking, I think there's far too narrow of a conception on where the continent can contribute, right? When I engage in some conversations around supply chain diversification, advanced manufacturing, things like that. Africa and the continent is generally viewed as a source for some of the raw materials, and the more upstream aspects of the supply chain. When there really is great dynamism on the continent. There really are great opportunities for us to make early investments, relatively small investments into human capital development, into kind of expanding infrastructure development to help African countries transition away from being just consumers of products and devices that are manufactured in other places, and reimagine the continent as a place where solutions for problems that may be pretty unique to local contexts are both designed, developed, and manufactured, closer to the markets and the people that actually are going to require those solutions. So I really do think that this is an area of opportunity for the United States to lean into, because we are, we are a leading economy in high tech fields and have very strong competitive advantages in high tech manufacturing, and with like as I said, with kind of relatively minimal investments, the gains that can be made and kind of the transformational development that can take place in some of the countries across Africa, and then the ensuing supply chains that can really grow domestically or kind of on the continent to not only solve the solutions or solve the problems that Africans are facing, but also alleviate some of the risks in the supply chain globally. That really can and should be happening and taking place. And I continue to try and have these conversations within the State Department. I am hopeful that in the near term we will begin to see new initiatives and new conversations taking place on the continent.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that. I'm gonna look. Abdi Shire's had his hand up for a while, and I'm gonna beg people's forgiveness. It turns out in the supply chain, it looks like I need some new glasses, so I'm having trouble seeing the names. But Abdi Shire, I think you're up with the first next question. And go ahead and unmute yourself, and feel free to put on your video if you want as well.
Thank you, Sam Kaplan, and also thanks to the contributor, Economic Officer Will. My name is Abdi Shire. I'm a community activist based here in Seattle, Washington.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
Do you have a question, Abdi, or while we're waiting for that, if he's having some broadband problems, Courtney Brooks, why don't you go ahead and ask your question about broadband, speaking of broadband and apps and so forth.
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, let's see. So yeah, I know you mentioned broadband as one of the elements in connectivity, and I wonder, like the oversight that we see in the US on apps like TikTok or Twitter, and then the General Data Protection Act that came out of the European Union. Is there a regulatory framework continent-wide or specific to different countries that is trying to regulate that or even look at privacy concerns?
I think I was speaking, somebody was disrupting. What's going on?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Abdi, you cut out for a minute. Twitter, if you can hold on for a second, we'll have you ask your questions as a follow-up. When we couldn't hear you, we had Courtney ask a question. So bear with us. Let's let Will answer Courtney's question, and we'll come right back to you, Abdi. My apologies. Go ahead, Will.
All right, Courtney, yeah, thank you for that question. It's a really great question. And again, another one of the conversations that, I love engaging in and I'm really trying to figure out how, we can kind of support development in this area. Really in a word, no, the frameworks generally don't exist. Data protection frameworks, privacy frameworks, and really, things, what you, I guess, consider to be guardrails on, policy guardrails on what governments and companies can do, with surveillance tools, data tools, and all of these tools that can unlock tremendous potential, but also can pose tremendous risk. And so, I think that really is an area, at the federal level, the United States hasn't really figured that out yet, right? But there certainly are a lot of, experts within the United States, within the United States government on these issues that I think with concerted effort, we can really help to build some of those frameworks that would allow really broad scale adoption of technologies that can really drive the economic development forward and make it really, again, I'm probably going to overuse this word a little bit, but really transform people's lives on the continent. So I think that's a great question and definitely something that we we need to continue to encourage the construction of.
Great.
Thank you, Abdi. Let's go back to you, and if you could state your question, that'd be great. And you're unmuted, so go for it.
Yeah, also I thank you for some. I also put in the chat. My suggestion is that indeed the China and being in footprint in Africa or elsewhere, there are opportunity miss it on foster stability in Africa at large in the world. I think a lack of honest and sustainable foreign policy in our U.S. government, which lies party line versus one Democrat in the power, they have their own kind of agenda, and also when Republican comes to their next term, like party line had contributed, rising China and other adversaries, which we call it friendly nations, Europeans, et cetera, had leading footprint infrastructure and lending massive development projects in Africa. An example, I am from Somalia. In Somalia, past 15 years, US government has pledged massive amount of money, which is taxpayer money as aid. Yet in the ground, could not found even a shallow well or mother health post, MCH, in which rural area built. It is rather than drones indiscriminately killing the civilians. So my question to the panelists is there a large number of African diaspora educators and intellectuals here in the United States. How could be a resource in a doing better outcome rather than the photo up we saw a similar in recent US African Leaders Summit here in Washington, DC on December 15th. So that's what my suggestion is, that in order to be in competence and better effective, US is the number one world generous leading contribute to the United Nations. But what that money does is could harm American interests. As I'm American, if I've been going to the outside of the world, I've been having a backlash, which our foreign policy and our way we help in the world are not in the same in line. So how can we help? That's what I'm suggesting, that we are most educated.
Got it, Abdi. Will, why don't you go ahead and respond to that?
Yeah, so I think the question that I heard, and let me know if I got that correct, Abdi, is how can we kind of more effectively capitalize on some of the intellectual capacity, African intellectual capacity that may not be on the continent, but is in fact in the United States to help reach better development outcomes? Is that the question?
Yeah, that's the question. Example, in Somalia, past 15 years.
I think we need another example. That we got plenty of examples. Will respond to the question. Go ahead, Will.
That honestly, that really is a question that I'm trying to understand myself as well. I think one of the things that I want to do in the position that I have while I'm here is to help to elevate more African voices within kind of the policy conversations that take place inside of the U.S. government, right? We often, I'm here today speaking and kind of sharing my perspectives with you all, but more often the roles are actually reversed, where I'm pulling together groups of U.S. government officials to listen to experts on the outside or from the outside, as they share their thoughts and their opinions on what U.S. policies should be in certain arenas. And several of the things that I've said tonight are informed by some of those conversations that I've had. And I really find great value in hearing from experts outside of the government. In particular, I really find great value when thinking about how the United States can approach our engagement on the continent. I really find great value in hearing from people who have who grew up on the continent, who were born, raised, may have left the continent, to go seek other opportunities, which is really part of kind of everybody's right of self-determination. But how can we do better at that? I think it just takes intentional action on our behalf to seek out those voices, to seek out those individuals, and to really elevate the perspectives that they have, and not only seek them out and hear them, but listen and incorporate those thoughts into our policy discussions. But it doesn't really stop at I think experts that are outside of the continent. There's, as I said before, there's tremendous dynamism and really intellectual capacity here on the continent. And so, how can we more effectively engage with those individuals as well? And the final thing I'll say on this, I think it's well and good for us to incorporate some of those voices and opinions in our own policy towards the continent. But is there a role that the United States can play in elevating those voices within their own countries and within their own context, and ensuring that as I said, democracies need to be able to deliver for their people. And so, part of delivering for the people is being responsive to people's views and thoughts and opinions. And so is there a role that the United States can play in elevating some of those thoughts and opinions so that they are incorporated into what democracies do on the continent moving forward?
That's great. Carrie has a question in the chat room regarding the way China and the US provide grants and loans and so forth. Carrie, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi there, thank you. So my question is, with regard to how quickly and by what standards the US government makes awards and funds programs in Africa, classically with the work I've done is I've seen that China is much quicker. One example of that is, I'm sure you're well aware, is Millennium Challenge Corporation and their scorecards. So, one of the ongoing issues is if they can get funding, even understanding the trade-offs with letting China make those investments, if they can either get funding at all or get funding more quickly through China, that's often the place that's going to happen. So can you maybe give us an update on what the US government's doing to try to address that without relaxing standards around, human rights, gender-based violence, that sort of stuff?
Yeah, sure. I think the part of the last point that you made is really important, and that's the standards. That we continue to maintain our standards, not only around human rights and gender-based violence, but also about around some of the democratic outcomes and ensuring that the financial assistance and financial engagement that we undertake on the continent is not used for kind of regression in democratic norms and institutions across the continent. And frankly speaking, we have not done a good enough job of it. By kind of reorienting some of the institutions, some of the development institutions of the government, we've tried to kind of streamline the process internally that we undertake. But the reality is, that we operate in democracy and operate in, under the rule of law, and our engagements are shaped by the legislation that is passed in Congress, and which authorizes us to make these financial outlays. And so we have to adhere as closely, we have to adhere to what Congress lays out, and in this case, Congress lays out a very a very specific process that requires competition and requires, that we maximize all of the kind of potential that's inherent to our private sector led overseas investment and engagement. And that really is the bottom line of it, right? Is that by and large, our engagement is channeled through the private sector, whereas our competitor, the PRC, is able to just be much more agile and can act much faster because decisions do not have to be made in transparent, kind of open manner. If the Communist Party or the central government in Beijing says that something is going to happen, then something will happen. It's not necessarily that easy within the U.S. government. So it is a challenge. But what I will say is that in my conversations with folks across the continent, they want the United States to be engaged because they know that with U.S. engagement, economic engagement, comes real sustainable partnerships that aren't just transaction based, as I mentioned before, right? When the United States invests, it invests for the long haul. And it invests for the long term. And, that really is our key competitive advantage is that reputation that our private sector carries with it. And so, how can we more effectively utilize and kind of put to work our private sector? Well, that's the challenge that we really face here on the continent because, some of the appetite for risk that PRC companies, be they state-owned or just connected with the government or even private companies, are able to take many more risks and have a larger risk appetite than some of our companies do. And, part of that is, again, going back to the rule of law and the fiduciary responsibility that our companies have to shareholders. So these are all kind of components to the broader challenge, which is, how can we effectively engage with the private sector? But I think it takes just that, right? It takes engagement and it takes figuring out mechanisms to allow them to see some of the dynamism and some of the potential that may not be, as readily apparent as some of the investments that they would consider making in the United States or in areas that are kind of closer to the periphery of the United States.
So John Lucas has a somewhat related question about China's model and perceptions of it. John, go ahead.
Yeah, so you've already answered a lot of what I was wondering about right there. So thanks. I was just wondering, the U.S. has a different model for engaging with Africa than China. I mean, with more of a private sector emphasis and more emphasis on democracy and rule of law. And I was just wondering from the standpoint of African countries, how they evaluate the pluses and minuses, and then realizing there's 50 countries and there might be different groups of countries that evaluate it differently. Kind of similar to what you're talking about, how African countries look at kind of the advantages and disadvantages of the private sector based approach of the U.S.
So, I think brand America is very strong. There are not only is there an attractiveness of kind of the cultural attractiveness of the United States, which really resonates on the continent here, but the attractiveness of our globally recognized brands and the contributions that they can make are very, very welcome on the continent, right? And I don't think, and I had a conversation with someone earlier today, and they made this point, right? African governments don't view this as a zero sum, and in large part we shouldn't either, right? We shouldn't view this as putting African governments in a position where we require them to make a choice between, engagement with the PRC or engagement with the United States or any other partner out there, right? What we should be doing is presenting the best version of ourselves and allowing that to make the kind of choice, right? And I think when we do that, and when we show up, and when we're engaged, and I'm speaking kind of in the small d democracy we, as opposed to just the United States and government, but when Americans show up and engage, we're welcomed, and oftentimes we are preferred. But kind of going back to what I was saying before, too often we don't show up. We don't show up as private citizens. We don't show up as private companies for myriad reasons, for various reasons. But I think we do have a lot to offer to the continent, by way of partnership, and it's really imperative on the U.S. government to ensure that those partnerships can take hold and do take hold. So I think to answer your question, really our model is very welcomed. Our model of engagement, private sector engagement, is very welcome. And I will say that's not to say that there are no kind of positive aspects or attributes of PRC engagement either, right? PRC firms, companies, the policy and development banks have delivered tremendous levels of infrastructure development on the continent, and that is good for the African people, for African societies, and we should encourage that, because frankly speaking, the United States is not going to replace all of that infrastructure development. And I don't think that we should be trying to, right? I don't think that we should be trying to crowd China out everywhere and every place. We should be maximizing on our key competitive advantages, and ensuring that governments are equipped with kind of the with all of the information they need to make good decisions on development plans and implementing those plans for the future. So I think there's a role for all of us to play on the continent, all of us as a global community to play on the continent to ensure that it reaches its maximum potential. But that means that our engagement can't just be about extracting value, but it has to be about really creating value and ensuring that value creation on the continent happens both with the efforts of outside partners and by encouraging the development of the human capital and human capacity, and then the kind of innate capacity here on the continent.
Thomas Countryman has a question on corruption, and C. Cruz, I see you with your hand up. We'll go to you after this question. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much, Mr. Campbell. Very good summary of what we need to be thinking about on this important continent. In my view, corruption is the biggest threat to democracy in Africa, as it is in Europe, indeed as it is in the United States. And I wonder if you have any comments both about the effect of Chinese influence and Chinese business on the corruption problem in Africa, and whether we do enough to help societies combat corruption. And then maybe if you have a minute, just a couple of sentences on the key results of the summit President Biden held last week with African leaders. Thanks very much.
Sure. I'll get to the corruption piece first, and then I can give just a couple of reflections on the African Leader Summit, the U.S. Africa Leader Summit. I think I agree with you. Corruption is absolutely a danger to democratic development and maintenance of democratic institutions and norms. And I think we need to be doing as much as we can to help governments that are interested in rooting out that corruption, root out that corruption. The bottom line is, and frankly speaking, that some of the corruption, that we see on the continent is kind of so ingrained into the organization of political institutions and the kind of political machines, that it really can be difficult to understand as outsiders just the breadth of how that really affects what is happening on the ground. I think one of the key strengths in our model, and really just one of the key tools that we as a government have to ensure that we're not contributing to that corruption as a country, is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And it really is when people know that a U.S. company is involved or the U.S. government is involved with U.S. private sector in an area, it really is a signal that this needs to be clean, and this needs to be done in a very above board fashion, whatever that engagement might be. The reality is, though, that PRC and several other countries that work in these spaces don't have similar tools, right? They don't require they don't have similar standards for their companies that go abroad. And I think that's a real challenge, because it if you don't have those tools, you're not interested in developing those tools, and you're not interested in taking the steps that even in the absence of those tools, governments can take to tamp down some of these things, then it really is just going to kind of feed into some of the systems and cycles of corruption that we see on the continent. And so, I think there is more that we can be doing as a government to, really impress upon folks the importance of tamping down corruption and rooting out corruption. But it really is going to depend on choices that African governments and African people and African societies make for themselves in saying enough. We cannot have this. I think publics, and young people, and the kind of populations are there, but those that are in power and that are closest to the trappings of power that can benefit the most from this, right? The ones that would be required to make those decisions and sacrifices, unfortunately for them, the inducements to corruption are stronger than kind of the inducement to rooting it out. And that's why I think we find ourselves kind of in this perpetual cycle of corruption that really is one of the main impediments to development on the continent. Now, switching gears to your other question about the Africa Leaders Summit, I think for me, two of the biggest takeaways for me is the level of commitment that the president made over the next 3 years, committing $55 billion of assistance over the course of the next 3 years, in various forms. And there's a lot of information out there kind of on exactly how those, how that assistance is going to take place. But just that level of commitment over a 3-year time period is something that really is unprecedented. And I will say it reflects not only kind of our forward-looking commitment to the continent, but it really reflects also, I think, the historic commitment that we've made to the continent through all of the different methods of engagement that we've undertaken, but not really been that great at talking about, right? We haven't been that great at telling our story, whereas some of the other development partners that you see on the continent, you know, their engagement is all about the story and not necessarily about, you know, the actual facts on the ground. And you know, as with PEPFAR, as with, you know, some of our COVID you know, assistance, food security assistance, you know, which we've doubled this year to the continent. You know, these things, they aren't as visible or as tangible as a bridge, but the opportunities, the life chances that they provide are you know, far greater than you know, just kind of a railroad going through a farm village. So you know, we need to do a better job of telling that story, and that, you know, gets to my kind of second takeaway, which is you know, that I think the African Leaders Summit really was a strong encapsulation of that story, and of, you know, just kind of the optics of the secretary sitting with, you know, African leaders, of the president sitting with African leaders, and you know, saying, we are committed. How can we help? What do you need? And helping, you know, ensuring that vision guides our commitment, you know, is a real key, in my book, win for us in the African Leaders Summit.
C. Cruz, if you could unmute yourself, and we're getting towards the end, so let's make our questions quick if we can.
Hello, everyone. I'm very thankful to be part of this forum. I'm Chiquito Cruz. I have taught in Sierra Leone, West Africa for many years, and also have taught over 30 years in the US. My question is more or less, my passion is for education, and for especially the young Africans, you know, that really are unengaged, which creates a problem for Africa. And my dream is to see more of an exchange program, more African countries being in more exchange programs in the US, vice versa. And also on the creation of jobs in Africa for these young people. More or less the overall goal in education, how education should be affecting the young Africans in Africa.
I agree. You know, I really think engaging with the youth, which, you know, is the continent right now is undergoing a youth bulge, and has, you know, really large working age population that needs to be engaged, that needs to be put to work, that needs you know, gainful employment. You know, we all, I think, understand the dignity that comes along with gainful employment, and you know, finding opportunities to you know, feed ourselves and our family. And so you know, I think, again, this kind of gets back to the point that I've tried to make throughout, you know, is that US investment, you know, private sector investment, US government engagement is really about making a commitment, a long-term commitment to solve some of those problems and some of those key challenges. So, you know, I also encourage, you know, the State Department and, you know, our government to create more opportunities for exchange programs, and you know, trying to find ways to engage young people and show young people some of the you know, some of the positive aspects of relations with the United States, and the understanding that, you know, those young people are going to be the future leaders on the continent here. And so, you know, the more that we can do to expose them to you know, what the United States has to offer, you know, as a country, you know, more we'll be doing to ensure that our that our peoples have good relations, into the future. So I agree 100%, and I look at programs like the Young African Leaders Initiative, YALI, as really fundamental to that effort to engage the youth. I continue to encourage, as I said, I continue to encourage our government to do more of that.
And Brian Giles, go ahead. You have a question on trade wars in U.S., China, and Africa. We may have, Brian, are you there? I don't see you on. Maybe we lost you. So since we're getting right towards the end of our time, actually, maybe it's perfect that we end with Bill Marshak, your old colleague, young colleague, I should say. Bill, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, my question pertained to U.S. education initiatives on the continent. From the standpoint, we just discussed, you just answered a question on education that reflects on education as diplomacy. On a practical business side, looking at the potential for increased involvement of African economies in manufacturing and higher tech supply chains. Thinking of Intel's experience in Vietnam, where they committed to a huge investment and then discovered there was nobody to hire to work in it. And thinking in terms of preparing local companies, especially small, medium companies in African countries, for inclusion in supply chains, because there's any number of regulatory and standards issues there. Are there any U.S. government education initiatives or major exchanges with institutions on the continent at this point?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. That's a great question, Bill. And again, it's great to see you. Really happy to to be on this call with you. One of the, I think, historic strengths of U.S. engagement on the continent has been our engagement through USAID, the Agency for International Development, and education is one of the key components of USAID's engagement. And speaking very generally, because the situation obviously isn't going to be the same in every African country, but there are tremendous education systems on the continent. It really is just kind of about opportunities to advance beyond that, right? And then once, take a country like Kenya, once students graduate from university, they end up underemployed because there just aren't enough opportunities. There isn't investment made. There's been tremendous investment made on the education side, but the investment on the economic side that would, marry up with that education, the level of education that they're receiving just has not yet been made in ways that, again, to overuse my favorite word, in ways that are transformative, for the society. So, I think that really is the challenge, is how can we unlock that private sector investment, because they really will not find a situation like you're describing in Vietnam where there is no one to hire, right? If they open their doors, if they were to make those investments, I think people would really be shocked at the level of capacity and the quality of the human capital that really exists in some of these countries here. Again, speaking generally, leaving room for differences in different contexts. And I'll just kind of leave you with one example, and not without naming anything, but there is a kind of, I was having a conversation with a high-tech manufacturer, representative from a high-tech manufacturing company, Kenyan company that does contract manufacturing of high-tech devices, and his statement to me really was that under the surface that you don't yet see it. And we're not talking about the software side, right? Which not to denigrate that, but I think the manufacturing side is what really is the transformative and really has the potential to be that transformative aspect. But he said there really is, there a bubbling movement of companies in that space that 4 or 5 years from now we're gonna look and we're gonna say, wow, were we missing that? How were we missing that? And if we can encourage our companies to really get in on the ground now, not only will it be great for development purposes, but it will be great for our relations and for the future of our relations as the nation with this really dynamic continent that I've only been here for 1.5 years, but have really fallen in love with the potential and what I see as really a great future. Again, if we can if we can really help unlock that.
That's a great positive.
That's a wonderful way to end it. At the beginning of the program, Irina showed the great video of what the State Department is doing, how they're representing our country and we Americans overseas. Will, I think you're the perfect encapsulation of that. Such great knowledge you brought to us, such great experience, and obviously great diplomatic skills. Let's give him a big hand and thank you, Will, for today. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Sam, and thank you again, to the board and everybody at the World Affairs Council in Tacoma. I really hope that we can stay engaged and continue this conversation. One thing that I always like to say, kind of in any context, is whatever is said in the course of this conversation, let it not be the end of it. Let it just be the beginning.
That's wonderful. We look forward to maybe seeing you over there. And when you come here to the Seattle Tacoma area, we will buy you either a nice glass of Washington State wine or a good glass of microbrew. Or coffee.
Awesome.
That's very, thank you, Sam. Thank you, Will. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much. I'm going to pause the recording right now, and I would like to ask the speaker, Irina, and board members stay, because we will do a brief debriefing. Otherwise, all other participants, thank you for coming, and I will see you on the next program. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.